Hello, my name is Gary Scudder, professor here in the core. And today's core talk, I want to talk about a subject that I talk about in the core 120, concepts of community. And I'll talk about a few other things along the way, but essentially what I'm talking about is a particular approach I take. And I want to talk about is Utopian Socialism. Which is a topic which I think we should really spend more time on. I've used the Utopian Socialists in Core 120 for years now, and I think they work very well. And it's not simply because of my own shockingly leftist views, but simply because I think it fits the class very well. You know, because we tend to view, if you think about it, the big project for students in Core 120 is the creation of a good, just, and sustainable society. So we'll spend time on Plato, and Plato is cool, but Plato lived a long time ago talking philosophically about how a society might come together. And Adam Smith is talking specifically about sort of human exchange and why we do what we do. And for that matter, Marx, as much as we all love Marx, in the end is essentially saying this is what's really wrong with the society and not much on how one constructs a society. And the utopians, and obviously there are a lot of things wrong with the utopians, and they've sort of been, sadly, I think, tossed into the trash heap of history, probably more by the left than the right, because we know Marx didn't like them at all. I mean, think about what the utopians do. They literally tried to construct societies. And they weren't speaking philosophically. They were down to this is what the building would be looking like, and this is what you spend your day doing, and this is how you divide your time up. And, you know, sometimes they actually set up places. And I have used them, and I think in the future I'm actually going to use utopians even more. Now, one quick note before we get started, and that is, as I've redesigned the 120s, I've really pushed Smith and Marx up to the front, so that for the rest of the class, everything you look at, you can always go back to Smith or Marx. So understand, before I do anything else, before I even get to Plato, I've already talked about Smith and Marx, because I think this is always the default thing that you fall back on to give the students some sense of foundation. Okay, so what we're going to do is this. My excellent assistant, Roshan, is going to turn the camera and focus in on my screen. Perfect. Thank you. Like I said, the utopians are fascinating. This is actually one of the diagrams of the time of what a utopian community might look like. I mean, there are a lot of utopian socialists you can talk about. I mean, certainly Saint-Simon is fascinating. And if you just go to the World Socialist Organization website, they have a huge treasure trove of utopian socialist writings. Now, I tend to spend time on two folks. Charles Fourier, be the one I spend most of my time on. Utterly fascinating. He's sort of classic in that he sort of wrote and then people ignored him. But if you read his Social Destiny of Man, it's really fascinating. And it's kind of fun to pull up. So Social Destiny of Man, if you just do a search for Charles Fourier or Social Destiny of Man, you'll find lots of examples. And again, if you go to the Socialist website, you'll find just a treasure trove of stuff. And again, you can just see from some of the diagrams here, the fact that we got down to even designing what the buildings would look like. So they really thought about this, not purely in a philosophical way, but in a way that would work. So let me show you a little bit of his writings, which I think are interesting. For instance, here's Fourier talking about human passion. And he said, the passions, believed to be the enemies of concord, in reality conduce to that unity from which we deem them so far removed. It is this which has caused philosophers to say that we ought to repress them, an opinion doubly absurd inasmuch as we can only repress our passions by violence or absorbing replacement, which replacement is no repression. And what I like about this, and then I always show my students this particular quote, is Fourier is trying to understand human nature. And this is one of the beautiful things that I think you can do with the utopians especially, is they really work as a nice transition from concepts of the self to concepts of community. Because these guys, no matter who they are, and certainly Plato falls into this category, Adam Smith falls into this category, they're always about human nature. If you understand human nature, then you can begin to construct a society. So I ask my students, okay, you've just finished Core 110. What are the essential human passions or desires? Think back on your reading from Hawke or Linden. And is the notion here to fit human nature to society, which Rousseau would warn us against, or is the notion to figure out human nature and fit society to it? So I think this is a lovely transition, and you sort of leave time for the students to design essentially their sense of human nature and how you might, in a very strategic way, fit it to society. He talked a lot about associative labor. He said this, he said, labor nevertheless forms the delight of various creatures such as beavers, bees, well, Kristen Wolfe would like this, wasps, ants, which are entirely at liberty to prefer inertia. But God has provided them with a social mechanism which attracts to industry and causes happiness to be found in industry. Why should he not have accorded to us the same favor as these animals? So essentially his point is we can be and should be a very social animal. That instead we've allowed ourselves to be an individual animal which does not think about the greater needs of society. When he says, so these other members of the animal kingdom are much more associative and they're much more successful, and that's how we need to think about it. So he said associative labor, in order to exert a strong attraction among people, will have to differ in every particular from the repulsive conditions which render it so odious in the existing state of things, which allows us to start taking a step back and say, okay, what is the age in which he's living? Why is he saying that this is so odious and horrible? And why is it so odious? And the notion is, let's create a very different society than the one we have now. He also has what he calls the laws of associative labor, and I could go through all of them, but I won't. I will go through a few of them because I think they're really fascinating. He says, for instance, that every laborer be a partner, remunerated by dividends and not by wages. And this is really a good one to stop and think about, what the hell's he even talking about? And why do we have wages anyway? And if we're talking about dividends, are we talking about more of a partnership of society? And does this actually work? Then in step 2 of his laws of associative labor, he says that every one man, woman, or child be remunerated in proportion to the 3 faculties, capital, labor, and talent, which I think also very nicely allows us to come back to Plato and talk about why he agrees this, or for that matter what Marx would say about this, about who gets the benefits of society and why they get it and how much they get. And this is where it gets kind of weird, but also I think very funny. He says that the industrial sessions, that is what you do in a day, be varied about 8 times a day, it being impossible to sustain enthusiasm longer than an hour and a half or 2 hours in the exercise of agricultural or manufacturing labor. So essentially you should change your job 8 times a day because it fits what he called the butterfly passion, that we by our nature like to flit around and do things. And he says that they be carried out on by bands of friends united spontaneously, interested and stimulated by very active rivalries. And on the one hand, you look at this and go like, so you're kind of a nut, aren't you? And I always ask my students, okay, so what would Smith say about this? Let's say what Smith said about the example of the pin factory. How efficient would this be? And the students would say, well, Smith would say this is stupid. And it's not particularly efficient. And of course, the question then becomes, the obvious question is, well, so what? Which is a more complex question than you think it is, because what's the point of this? Is the point of society to be efficient? Is the point of work to make lots of money? Is it not enough that you're happy? And it really gives them something to think about as they begin to think, why do we do what we do as a society anyway? And I could go on and on, but for instance, number 7, in this distribution, each one, man, woman, or child, be in full enjoyment of the right to labor or their right to engage in such branch of labor as they may please to select, provided they give proof of integrity and ability. So essentially, you do what you want to do, as long as you're not totally incompetent at it, which also makes you wonder, what's the point of any of this? And it really, if they're constructing a good, just, and sustainable society, they need to figure out, one, about human nature, but what do you want to accomplish? Do you want to create what we have? This is also a good place to bring in the Trianda study on individualism and collectivism, and the fact that, yes, we're more efficient, but we're also unhappy and miserable and have all sorts of bad aspects of this. Now, to be fair, there's also aspects of Fourier, which I think I just do just because they're funny. Like Fourier talking about children. And he said the perception is that children are little idlers. Nothing is more erroneous. Children are already at 2 or 3 years of age very industrious. But we must know the springs which nature wishes to put in action to attract them to industry. He says, for instance, what do children like? Well, they like rummaging. They like to handle everything. They like to change occupations. They like commotion. They like noisy occupations. So consequently, turn the dump over to them because they will be in hog heaven. And on the one hand, okay, so does this mean that you're just kind of kooky, or are you making a more profound point? And how far do you take this? Are we literally trying to assume that we have to use child labor? We just have to make it fit them? So Fourier, I think, is fascinating, and the students really react to him, especially the notion of changing jobs 8 times a day. I also spent some time on Robert Owen. Owen is a better example in the fact that he created both a very successful utopian society, but also one which did not work very well. And I think in the future I'm going to spend more time on New Lanark, have the students analyze New Lanark using both Smith and Marx, because New Lanark lasted for decades. But I think also spend some time looking at New Harmony, his utopian society he set up in Indiana. I'm from Indiana, so I can tell you he went there because there's nothing happening, which failed magnificently in 3 years. So I think it would be a fascinating case study of why societies do not work. Now, by way of conclusion, and again, thank you for Roshan. I gave her a very difficult task today, lots of camera work. The last few comments I'll make is I've used the utopians a lot. It always tends to work. The students get them. They understand what they're trying to do. Even if they think they're kind of funny, it actually promotes conversation. And in the future, I think I'm going to actually use more of them. As I always say, I've got some lovely PowerPoints because I'm the king of all PowerPoints. If anyone would like to just talk to me about this, I'm more than happy to share ideas. So that's it. Thank you very much.